Unit 4, Road to Revolution, Chapter 11, The Alamo and Goliad, Lesson 3, Defeat in South Texas. We will learn how a series of defeats in South Texas threatened the Texans' cause. Okay. I'm going to try to do this in Speedy Gonzalez time. Terms to know: civilian, a person not in the armed services. Refuge, shelter. Alter, to change. Considerable, large, sufficient. Texan forces are defeated. Guiding question: why did the Texan army suffer defeat in a number of battles in South Texas? While Santa Anna marched toward San Antonio, General Jose de Urrea advanced from Matamoros northward in South Texas with some 1,000 troops. His goal was to strike settlements near the coast and the Texan garrison at the old La Bahia, Presidio, and Goliad. The Texans' misguided plan to attack Matamoros led to their first encounter with Urrea's troops. Frank W. Johnson and Dr. James Grant were among those ordered to carry out this attack. Rather than combining forces with Colonel James Fannin at Goliad, they set up several small camps in and around San Patricio. On February 27, 1836, Urrea's army defeated Johnson's forces. Only Johnson and 4 others escaped. 3 days later, Urrea defeated Dr. Grant and about 30 soldiers at Agua Dulce Creek. Civilians, people not in the military. In Urrea's path, civilians, people not in the military, in Urrea's path felt threatened. Some asked Fannin at Goliad for help. He sent Captain Ammon B. King and a small force to lead the civilians to safety. When they ran into part of Urrea's army, the Texans took refuge or shelter in Refugio. They sent Fannin a request for more troops. General Sam Houston had told Fannin not to divide his force. By sending King to rescue the civilians, Fannin had disobeyed Houston's orders. Then Fannin made things worse by sending Colonel William Ward and more than 100 Texans to relieve King. Urrea's troops found them near the mission. In the fight that followed, King and most of his men were killed or captured. Ward's losses were heavy, but he escaped with some troops back to Goliad. Urrea defeats Johnson at San Patricio, Dr. Grant at Agua Dulce Creek, and King and Ward at Refugio. In late February, Fannin wanted to withdraw from Goliad, but he was ordered to stay. The fall of the Alamo on March 6 altered or changed the situation. His troops were farther west than other Texan forces, putting them at risk. They also had few supplies. On March 14th, Fannin received orders from Houston to retreat toward Guadalupe Victoria. However, Fannin waited several days. He hoped King and Ward would return. Not until March 19th did Fannin finally begin to withdraw. Fannin badly managed his withdrawal from Goliad. Houston had told him to dump heavy cannons into the river. Instead, he took them along. This slowed his army. Wagon breakdowns caused further problems. The attack came that same day as Fannin's troops marched across an open prairie. They were about 2 miles from Coleto Creek. Suddenly, Urrea's troops appeared and surrounded the Texans. Fannin assembled his soldiers to meet Urrea's attack. The Mexican troops charged 3 times, and each time Fannin's men drove them back. 7 Texans were killed and 60 were wounded, including Fannin. During the day's fighting, the Texans spent a miserable night. They were short of water, and they could not care for their wounded. Also, expected reinforcements failed to arrive. Urrea, who had hundreds more troops in the area, did receive additional men as well as artillery. In the early morning of March 20th, Mexican cannons opened fire on the Texans. After a discussion with his officers, Fannin decided that there was no point in continuing to fight a losing battle. He signed an agreement of surrender. A disastrous surrender. Guiding question: what effect did the execution of Texan troops at Goliad have on the Texas Revolution? Fannin and the Texans had expected to be treated fairly as prisoners of war. Fannin and Texans expected to be treated fairly as prisoners of war. Urrea was willing to grant them mercy, but the orders from Santa Anna were clear. No rebel should live. Fannin and his men were marched back to Goliad, as were other captured Texans. Urrea wrote to Santa Anna requesting that the lives of the prisoners be spared. In his reply, Santa Anna ordered their immediate execution. Letting them go, he thought, would free them to keep fighting. He also cited a Mexican law stating that the penalty for rebellion against the government was death. Urrea reluctantly agreed. On March 27th, any question as to the captured Texans' fate was gone. All able-bodied prisoners were divided into 3 columns and marched out onto the prairie. On a signal, the Mexican soldiers began firing at them. It is believed that about 340 Texans were killed on this day in what became known as the Goliad Massacre. Santa Anna had achieved 2 significant victories in March 1836. His forces had overrun the Alamo and taken Goliad. They now occupied 2 strongholds that controlled roadways to the main Texas settlements. With thousands of troops in the field, Santa Anna was in a good position to drive out the remaining Texan fighters. Texans saw the situation differently. The stand at the Alamo had inspired them. Goliad outraged them. Santa Anna's army was strong, but the Texans were still determined to fight. However, it was clear that changes had to be made. The Texans had fought bravely, but they had made a considerable or large number of mistakes, including splitting authority between volunteer and regular troops, trying to capture Matamoros, separating their forces into small groups, failing to ensure cooperation among their forces. Houston would work hard not to repeat these mistakes. In the meantime, word of the defeats at the Alamo and Coleto, as well as the massacre at Goliad, spread rapidly throughout Texas. Remember Goliad now joined Remember the Alamo as a rallying cry in the struggle for Texas independence.